So, lesson for today is kind of a part one on stewardship. Obviously, the lessons today lent themselves very heavily to stewardship, and Father Galloway covered a lot of ground in his sermon, did a fine job really introducing the topic for us. And I want to continue upon the themes that he talked about, namely that stewardship is a lot more than just money. Money is perhaps even the tiniest part of what stewardship is. And when we talk about stewardship from a Christian perspective, there's three aspects of it that we harp on time and again. Who knows, what are those three things? They all begin with the same letter. Time. We've got time, treasure. That's the money part.
Stealing.
And stealing? Close. Talent. When it comes to stewardship, we talk about time, we talk about treasure, we talk about talent. Time, talent, and treasure rolls right off the tongue. Which of these, going back to Mark's sermon, which of these is the easiest, we would say?
I think the money is.
The money is, especially for Bob.
No way.
But is that, that's all in jest, of course, but Bob, is that what most people would say if you were to ask the Joe Schmo on the street? Would they say that your treasure is the easiest thing to give?
Say that's the hardest.
No way. Treasure is the hardest. I can barely make ends meet after I spend $200 a week betting on fantasy football and run into the liquor store and buying video games and Pokemon cards and what have you. Yeah, I don't have any money to give to God, so people get hung up on the money pretty easily. But as Mark mentioned, money is the easy part. Why is money so easy? Or why, in principle, is money actually the easiest part?
Because I don't have any.
Well, yeah, if you don't have any, sure. The $3 Mark was waving around, that's what we pay him per month as an honorarium. Yeah, if we just print them bigger. We actually just print them large monopoly money. The church does it. It saves us a lot. But once you give money, if you give money, does it take any effort? No. There's zero energy involved. You just write a check or you put some money in an envelope and you hand it away, and we presume that it takes care of itself. And of course, if you're giving your money to a church, hopefully you know what your church is using your money for in ministry. You know that your local church is a trustworthy organization. But are all organizations trustworthy? No, of course not. Especially, and sadly, even many churches are not good stewards of their money. So treasure is the easiest. It's by no means trivial, but it is the easiest. And I think case in point, our current political moment, what do we like to do as far as political and governmental problems are concerned? Do we like to face our problems head on?
Give money to it.
Right, Bob. We throw money at it. We got a problem, just throw money at it. It doesn't even need to be our money. We like our grandchildren's and our great-grandchildren's money. Other people's money is much easier to spend than our own. But I digress. So I think that's in a nutshell why treasure is the easiest of these three things. So that leaves time and that leaves talent. So this discussion, for however long we take today, we'll dive into these things, and then Mark can pick up with whatever is on his heart next week as we formally observe Stewardship Sunday. But I want to talk about time and talent in reference to the themes from our readings today, which Mark touched upon in his sermon, and that's the idea, as we saw with the widows, the idea of giving our all not just giving out of our abundance, not just giving when it's easy, but giving our all. And we're not talking about just giving up all our money. We're challenged even more so to give our all when it comes to time and when it comes to talent as well. So I want to talk about an illustration, I think, first, which really puts it into perspective for me. Now, treasure, we'll begin with treasure just as a touchstone. When we talk about money, who here has made a budget before or worked with a budget before? I know at least one person who's worked with a budget before.
I'm forced to work.
And Barbara has made to work with a budget. So we'll talk to our budget experts here. Bickerstaffs, how would you explain a budget as it applies to money?
Making a plan as to what your income is and how you're going to spend it.
Right.
Setting up goals and setting up, systems that will keep you to spending it reasonably.
So a budget is a plan. And when we think of a budget, like you said, Bob, it's a plan for our money. So you know exactly what you receive for money, and you know exactly what it's being used for. As my great friend Dave Ramsey likes to say, you're giving every dollar a job. Because what happens when you don't make a budget for your money?
You don't know where it goes, and it goes fast.
Right, Bob, right, Nancy. It just goes. Money has a mind of its own like that. It happens to be used one way or another if you don't pay any attention to it. So a budget is pretty easy to understand when it comes to money. Do we do the same thing with our time? That's where the real challenge is for us, I think. So we budget our money. How might we budget our time? Roger, do your students use an agenda in school? Are they supposed to use an agenda? Do they still print those things out?
They still get them.
And your agenda blocks off the days of the week, and it's got your blocks of time. What's supposed to be the purpose of that agenda for your students?
So you can plan and succeed.
So you can plan and succeed. And we may not have our own physical agendas, but the principle still applies, right? If we're not budgeting our time and planning what we're going to use our time for, what's going to happen to it?
It goes away.
It just,
Sneaks away.
it goes, I don't know where it goes, Barbara, but it does. It flies right out the window.
Wisely invested in video games at school.
Yes. Oh, that's a very wise use. I learn a lot from those things. So, budgeting our money is very familiar to us. Budgeting our time, and really time and talent, I think are very heavily interrelated. So I think we'll talk about them almost as one and the same, that if we're using our time wisely, a wise use of our time usually and should equate also to a wise use of our talent, because you might be using your time for things, and if you're not using your talent for that period of time, it may not be as fruitful as it otherwise could be. So, talking about time, a wise use of our time should give itself to budgeting which time first. If we were to set out a schedule, here I go with the board again. If we were to set out a schedule for our week, we won't actually schedule out a whole week here, but which time in our week should come first?
Time for God.
Time for God. What does that time look like? What is this time with God? It came up in our sermon today. Sundays, church, worship. I would argue, if, let's just say hypothetically, we were being diligent and really to the letter about writing out our schedule for the week, you should write out your time for church first and plan everything else around it. The time with God comes first. And if you're one to read the Bible daily or listen to the Bible or spend time in prayer using prayer books, which we will one day print, not to worry, that time should be blocked off first. And I'll never forget in college, even though I admit college is a microcosm of real life and some things are very different in college, but one of the things, especially going to a nerdy engineering school, is that our time was very valuable, and we had a ton of different classes and a ton of different demands on our time, and it was all very focused. It was like a pressure cooker. And I had a mentor, a Christian mentor in college, who had some very wise advice for me, and that was when you're laying out your calendar, like in Microsoft Outlook, and you're talking about making the most of your spiritual time on campus with a Christian fellowship and with church, block out your time with God first and make everything else fit around it. That time for fellowship, that time for Bible study, that time for going to church, that should come first in our schedule. And no matter how much you have going on, no matter how difficult it is, there it is, giving our all again. No matter how difficult or unreasonable it might seem, block out that time first, and God has a way of honoring that. Everything else always has a way of getting done. It might not get done the way that we want it to get done, but God will take care of those things. You'll recall again from our reading today, 1 Kings. Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. God has a way of honoring his people when his people honor him with their resources. And I think it's valuable for us to take the illustrations from today's readings and apply it to that same sense. So in both 1 Kings and in the gospel reading of Mark, we have these widows who are a typology of the Christian's response to Christ. That is, Christ gave himself once for all, as we read in Hebrews. Christ gave all of himself, and in response, we should give all of ourselves. But in the case of these widows, the poor woman in 1 Kings, she had very little food left. Was it easy for her to trust in Elijah and give up that first part of the morsels of food that she had? No. And when it came to the widow in the gospel reading of Mark, was it easy for her to give up her 2 pennies? No, it was quite literally all that she had. So why should we expect anything different with the stewardship of our time? Now, don't get me wrong, just as we can make idols out of giving of our money, we can make idols of ministry and we can make idols of time, and there is a healthy amount to be given, but the point being is, when it comes to time with God, it doesn't stop when it stops being easy. Stewarding our time with God doesn't just stop when it stops being easy. And this is something that I've struggled with for seasons myself, that for many of us, especially as lifelong churchgoers, going to church is easy. And it's easy just to say, well, I went to church for the week and I had a good time, and that's it. But there's 6 other days, and if we're going to church and doing and saying one thing on Sunday, and then doing and saying other things and living a totally different way for the other 6 days of the week, is that a good witness? Is that a good stewardship of our time? And as Mark alluded to in his sermon, sometimes it isn't easy to go to church, especially if we haven't budgeted our time, our schedule. Is the time for worship on Sundays always going to line up perfectly with what we would have otherwise planned to do? No. I think the perfect example of that was sports, especially for me and my brother. That's always a conflict, and God willing, when parents join our church and we have children in our fellowship, that will also be a source of difficulty where you have to budget your time and you have to decide whether making every single sports practice and game that falls on a Sunday, whether that is more important than being able to make it to church every Sunday. A wonderful example of that, in the other direction, is the story of Eric Liddell competing in the Olympics. He refused to compete on a Sunday at the highest level of competition. How easy would it have been for him to say, well, it's just one Sunday? And certainly, many others have chosen differently. But how powerful a witness was that? And that's the second part of what I want to talk about today, connecting this, our stewardship, to our witness and our ministry here at Holy Communion Anglican Church. This idea that our stewardship is directly connected to who we want to be as a congregation and how we want to grow and reach other people. I've talked to friends over the weeks and over the years, and for some, especially those who grew up in church circles, it's obvious when we're saying one thing and doing another. How many people do you know who have said, well, I stopped going to church because, well, they're a bunch of hypocrites. They made a big deal of sitting in front and waving around their offering check and wearing nice clothes and singing really loud, but I know that guy's cheating on his wife and they're not doing anything about it, and this guy is stealing from his office and this, that, and the other thing. Not saying that one's reasons for not going to church are 100% justified, but those observations hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the problem of the Christian church in America today, that we honor God with our lips, but we don't honor God with our hearts. And that's something that we need to guard ourselves against time and again, and this is what our reminder is as we approach Stewardship Sunday. What people are going to notice, and if we are going to grow as Holy Communion Anglican Church, it's that we're not just a people who gathers on Sundays, but we take what we learn and what we worship on Sundays, and it follows us. We bring it with us throughout the week. We glorify God in what we do. We organize ministries. We fellowship with each other. We take it seriously, and we don't just worship as is convenient for our schedules or for public health mandates or for whatever political moment is going on. We are standing on the solid, firm foundation, the bedrock of Christ, and we're not being tossed to and fro by the winds of woke culture, of popular culture. That is what our witness is going to be, not just giving bigger and bigger checks on Sundays. That's not going to do any work for us. I'll tie it in and we'll finish with the catechism here, just a few of the questions that we have on stewardship. 136, what is the duty of all Christians? The duty of all Christians is to follow Christ, to come together week by week for corporate worship, and to work, pray, and give for the spread of the kingdom of God. 137, we might return to this next week. There's a lot here, but just listen to this question and how much is included in it, in addition to just our treasure. What then should the lifestyle of all Christians include in response to God's love for us? To come to God in personal prayer every day, to read the Bible daily, to receive Holy Communion frequently in an expectant faith, to follow the moral example of Jesus in our daily lives, to speak about Jesus openly. That's a tough one. As a Lord and Savior whom we personally know and love, to work for a biblical understanding of justice and reconciliation in the world, to uphold the biblical and historic Christian standards of marriage between a man and a woman, to bring up children to know, love, and serve the Lord Jesus Christ, to live and promote a biblical understanding of a culture of life, to give money for God's work and to strive to achieve the discipline of tithing, to give a personal service to the church and to our neighbors, and to let our lives be marked with self-denial and simplicity. We could spend an hour talking about all those things, and I think perhaps we will touch upon some of these things again next week. That's a long list, is it not? All of those things make up the principle of stewardship. There is a lot involved in there, and if we are not diligent with this whole list of things, aka living out Christian lives in front of our non-Christian friends and family and neighbors, the money doesn't matter because the money isn't going to make us grow. We could up our tithes to 20% and save up a huge sum of money to be able to buy our own building within the next year. But if we're not good stewards with our talents and with our treasures, all we're going to be is a group of 15 people with a big sum of money worshiping in a fancy building. And don't get me wrong, I am excited, God willing, to have our own space that isn't in a basement someday. But all of these things are tied together, and you can't have one without the other. So the growth comes not just with discipline with our treasure, but with our time and with our talents. So I'll take a pause there if there are any questions, and I won't beat on this horse too much because we will be returning to it next week and kind of finishing the rest of what needs to be said on Stewardship Sunday. So thank you all for listening.